Hello, class. Welcome to the lecture on the Constitution. Today we will be talking about all portions of the Constitution. But before we do that, we'll talk about our two other documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. Then we'll discuss the majority of this lecture will be on the Constitution, and in the end we'll discuss the Nevada Constitution and do a couple comparisons. So the roots of the Constitution started out uh, before the Revolutionary War, actually almost even before the French Indian War. No other nation in the 18th century had anything like the American Constitution. And that's part of what we mean when we talk about American exceptionalism. At that time, nobody had created this type of agreement. The colonial politics had propelled the new nation towards the Constitution because of several reasons. The distance from the English authority, so the monarchy in England was ruling everything in the United States, but they had no idea what was happening on the ground. They didn't have representation. Everything was decided by Parliament and the monarchy in England. And they had more social mobility in America than they did in England. They had started making covenants and promises amongst themselves. They had given themselves individual rights. They had violent borders. And of course, then taxation came along. As far as the violent borders, just to kind of give you an idea, the colonies on the right before the French Indian War was in green area right here. And Florida was run by Spain. Spain had Texas, and France had this other pink area there. After the war, which the colonists fought side by side with the British, then they expanded the territory of the British to this. However, this line here was made by the British, saying that the colonists could not pass, they couldn't expand to any other parts. So that was another problem that the colonists didn't like, is that they wanted to expand, they wanted to form new states. And then came the taxation after, after the war was in, 1763. Then you started seeing Great Britain started adding taxes to the colonists because they had jacked up such a debt from that war. They wanted the colonists to pay for it. So they started taxing sugar, taxing stamps. They started the Quartering Act after the war. They had all these soldiers that remained in the new colonies, and they had an act saying that you had to house the soldiers. And then, of course, everyone knows the Boston Tea Party, because they started taxing the tea, and so they were rebelling against them. And that's when the revolution began. So the colonists on July 4th, 1776, as we all know, was the day that they passed the Declaration of Independence. And this was basically a statement to the world of America's purposes. It had two reasons: statement of their principles and a list of grievances. At the beginning, it stated several things that we ended up basing the Constitution on. We hold these things to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with rights that cannot be taken away. These rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although this was property at first, but they changed it to the pursuit of happiness. And that people form their own government to protect their own rights, and governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then they listed this long list of grievances, complaints they had about the king and about Great Britain, violations of their rights of representation, leaving that standing army under civilian control, and then also the loss of their independent courts. So they emphasized their rights of representation and that they wanted to give their consent to be governed. If we look at this chart, your book shows you this chart, and it kind of shows all of the 7 American ideas that we talked about in the last chapter, in the last lecture. They're all pointed out to some degree in the Declaration of Independence, and then also going on into the Constitution. So I would take a look at this and read through each one just to kind of get an idea of the representation of those American ideas that were in the Declaration of Independence. So after the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers tried to make somewhat of a constitution. They called it the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to talk about that first. It's their first attempt at a constitution. It was basically an alliance of independent states. It allowed the states to have annual elections. They extended the right to vote, not to too many people, more to more white men. They had open legislative deliberations in public. So this was really, as far as states' rights, this is a great way of direct democracy where people were involved in making the decisions within their state. The national government, however, was very weak. It was dependent on the states. There was no chief executive, so there was no president. There was no central authority to tax, and there was no central power. They didn't have enough money to make a national military force or any kind of army. And each state had a single vote in Congress. And at the time, anything that needed to be passed had to be passed unanimously by all 13 colonies or states. And this, as we know today, that it's hard to get just a majority, but to get a complete consensus of everybody agreeing on everything is also quite difficult. So this brought us... actually, before the Articles of Confederation, we had the Revolutionary War. So I just like to play, just to get us into the feel of what the Revolutionary War was about. Which just amuse me. I'd like to play my favorite musical, which gives us a lot of history about that time.
The Battle of Yorktown. 1781.
Monsieur Hamilton!
Monsieur Lafayette!
In command where you belong!
Are you saying no sweat? We're finally on the field. We've had quite a run.
Immigrants,
We get the job done. So
I go back to France and bring freedom to my people if I'm given the chance.
we'll be with you when you do.
Go, lead your men.
See you on the other side.
Here we meet again!
I am not going away, ma, shop. I am not going away, ma, shop. Ain't no one just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not going away, ma, shop. I am not going away, ma, shop.
Till the world turns upside down. Till the
World turns upside down.
so much it feels more like a memory. This is where it gets me. On my feet, the enemy ahead of me. If this is the end of me, at least I have a friend with me. Weapon in my hand, a command of a memory. Then I remember my Eliza's expecting me. Not only that, my Eliza's expecting. We gotta go, gotta get the job done. Gotta start a new nation, gotta meet my son. Take the bullet, touch your gun. Take the bullet, touch your gun. Move undercover when we move as one. Through the night, we have one shot to live another day. We cannot let a stray gunshot give us away. We will fight up close. Seize the moment and stay in it. It's either that or meet the business end of a bayonet. Code word is Rochambeau. Take me, Rochambeau. Run your bullets now, go and go. So the American experiment begins. With my friends all scattered to the winds. Lawrence is in South Carolina, redefining bravery. We'll never be free until we end slavery. When we finally drop the British away, Lafayette is there waiting in Chesapeake Bay. How did we know that this plan would work? We had a spy on the inside, that's right.
Hercules Fire! Take a spy on the British government. I take the measurements, information, and then I smuggle it. Out to my brothers, revolutionary confident. I'm running with the sons of liberty, and I am loving. See, that's what happens when you up against the Ruffians. We in the shit now, somebody's gotta shuffle it. Hercules Mulligan, I need no introduction when you knock me down. I got the shoot back up again.
coat stands on a parapet.
We lower our guns as he frantically waves their white handkerchief.
And just like that, it's over. We tend to our wounded. We count our dead.
Black and white soldiers wonder alike if this really means freedom.
Not yet.
We negotiate the terms of surrender. I see George Washington smile. We escort the men out of Yorktown. They stagger home single file. Tens of thousands of people flood the streets. There are screams and church bells ringing. And as our fallen foes retreat, I hear the drinking song they're singing.
All right. So this was representative of right around the revolutionary time. And I just want to go back to that map. So during the French and Indian War, the colonists fought with the British against the French and the Indians. However, Native Americans, sorry. However, after that, the 13 years after that was when the Revolutionary War began. And at that point, the French joined in with the colonists against the British. So the Revolutionary War was aided by the French to help the colonists beat Great Britain. All right, so they tried the Articles of Confederation, and the things about the Articles of Confederation, there were successes and problems. The success was that the power was closer to the people because the states had power. They had just defeated the most powerful military in the world, the British. The population grew, the economy grew. The Northwest Ordinance, they were able to outlaw slavery in the Western lands. They established a process for individuals to buy land and a system for territories to become a state. However, the problems were, as I mentioned before, Congress couldn't raise any money. They couldn't raise taxes. They couldn't have any money. It was impossible to amend the articles because they needed all 13 colonies to agree, a unanimous vote. State governments were dominated by their legislatures, and there were no checks and balances, so some states got a little out of control. And with a weak national government, it was hard to stand up to foreign powers. So therefore, they needed a constitution. Not as simple as that, but we're moving right along. So our Constitution is the owner's manual, a rule book for American government. It's a statement of our fundamental principles, which governs the nation and or any organization. So it provides ground rules, organized political life, turned those American ideas we talked about into laws, and institutionalized American ideas. However, there were several challenges. We're going to talk about 6 of the main arguments that happened while they were trying to build the Constitution. So we'll start with the first one. The first one was how much power should the people have? So this was really hard. The founding fathers at the time, if you read in your chapter, it tells us some of their opinions that they didn't think that the average person, and probably rightly so, didn't know enough and shouldn't have the ability to vote, and that they should leave that to the more educated, more expert scholars and politicians who knew how to do this. So when they were trying to figure out how much power the people have, Madison's idea was called filtration, an indirect election. So the public would vote for men and later women who would in turn vote for public officials. So this is something in bold. So this means it'll be on the exam. In the original Constitution, people were given the right to vote only for their House of Representatives. So please remember that. We were only given the right to vote for the House of Representatives. Then the House of Representatives voted for their senators, and both together, the Senate and the House, voted for the president. But over time, citizens won more control through the amendments of the Constitution. They were able to elect their president. Then eventually they were able to elect the senators. Women got the right to vote. African Americans got the right to vote. And then in 1971, 18-year-olds, 18, 19, 20-year-olds got the right to vote. So originally, the power was not given to the people, but eventually we got the power back. The second problem is the problem of federalism. We're going to be talking more about federalism in the next lecture. And federalism is the division of powers between the national government and the state and local governments. So the problems here in the Constitution were that the Federalists thought that the federal government needed a lot more control so that they could tax people, so they'd have a budget, so they could build an army and all kinds of things. And the states felt like they wanted to keep control. But what happened was they came to a compromise. Both the national and state governments got some power. So the federal government took over many of the functions of government, but far fewer than Madison had hoped. He was a Federalist. And the states kept many of their other duties, far fewer than the state advocates had hoped. So this mixed system with a stronger national government but also power left for the state governments is called federalism. So many of the issues that we deal with today are because we have federalism. Whereas if you look at a country like France or Japan, their version of states, for example, in Japan, their prefectures do not have full power. They have some local power, but they don't have the kind of power that states do in the United States. Therefore, if they need to get something done, the federal government can make a law and everybody has to follow it. Same thing in France. However, that's not the way it is in the United States, and therefore that's why we have many, many challenges. But there's some good points to that. All right, so the third problem is the big states versus the small states. And this is based on, the problem is geared around representation. So large states, if the representatives in Congress were based on population, then large states would have more power than small states. But if the representation was based on equality, where the same number of representatives per state, then the small states would have more power than the big states. So this led to a debate which will be on your first exam, and I will ask you to explain how we came up with how the Constitution, what the debate was in the Constitution regarding representation. So please pay attention to what's in bold. These are the things you need to remember and be able to tell me in your own words. So the debate led to two different plans being put forward, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And the Virginia plan, you can look in your book for more details. But basically, the things I need you to remember is they said, let's have 2 chambers and let's have the representatives based on population. Now, Virginia was a large state with a large population, so that meant that they would have a lot of control. And the smaller states like New Jersey said, no, we have a better idea. Let's have just 1 chamber. And let's make all states have equal vote. That would make smaller states have more power per person than larger states. So what they came up with was presented by someone from Connecticut, and this is called the Connecticut Compromise. And that's that we're going to have a bicameral, which means 2 houses. We'll have a House and the Senate, and the House will be based on population, and the Senate will be based on 2 representatives per state. So on your first exam, you will need to explain to me how the founding fathers came up with their plan for representation in Congress. And you'll have to know all those things. So I would highly recommend you go to the book and read through it so you're familiar with it and you can use your own words. All right, moving on to the fourth challenge. Oh, sorry. Before we go on to the fourth challenge, I just want to clarify terms. So Congress is the group of elected officials known as the representatives that make the laws for the country, also called the legislature. So we use these words intermittently, or we can exchange these words. So they can be called Congress or the legislature, and it's made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives is one of the two parts of Congress made up of representatives that are elected at the district level. The Senate is made up of the second part of the two parts, and these are senators that are elected by the entire state. Now, what I'd like to say here is oftentimes you'll hear in the news, people will call the House of Representatives Congress. That's okay, and that translates, but really Congress is both houses. And the other thing you need to know is that we vote for both of our senators, but we only vote for one of our 4 representatives in the state of Nevada. Or if you're in another state, you only vote for the representative that's in your district. But senators represent the entire state. All right, moving on. The fourth problem was the president. So as you can read in your book on this chapter, they had a lot of debate about this. They were concerned that maybe we should have a committee instead of an individual person because they were so worried that this would be the fetus or the birth of a monarchy. If we give one person too much power, we're going to return back to what we've just escaped from. We don't want to live in a monarchy where one person has too much power. So they ended up deciding eventually we're going to make it an individual. We're going to vote on it. We're going to give them a 4-year term. So this person can't stay in control like a monarchy. They have to be reelected every 4 years. And originally there was no term limits until we had an amendment to the Constitution, which we'll talk about later. And the way they would pick it would be that each state would select individuals known as electors. The delegates hope that the electors would be well-known individuals with sound judgment, and the electors would elect the president. So how many electors would they have? The electors would be based on the number of people in Congress. So originally, these were not these were people who could vote on their own. We'll see how the Electoral College metamorphosed to what it is today. But what hasn't changed is that the numbers of electors are based on each state's number of representatives. Please do not tell me in your answers that the people who vote for the president now are Congress. They are not the ones they are not our electors. Our electors are picked by the parties, the state parties actually, and we'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. All right. So we can look at the map. This is our present day Electoral College map. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, especially since we just went through a major presidential election, which as you know about the Electoral College, there have been times in the past where someone has received the popular vote, but the other person received 270 electoral votes. So this brings up people saying that's not fair. We don't have to worry about that this time because both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote was represented by President Biden. But in some cases, that is not the case. So we'll talk about the Electoral College. I have a video I'd like to show you, and whether it's fair or not, and what the consequences of going to a popular vote, and why the founding fathers were against it, and how that ratio has changed. We'll talk about that in a minute. The fifth problem is separation of powers. Because they didn't want the president or Congress or anyone to be too powerful, basically the Constitution gives a balanced power between the Congress, the president, and the judiciary. So the president over Congress, Congress can pass legislation, but the president can veto it. These are just some examples. The president is the commander in chief, but Congress has the power to declare war and to set the military budget. Congress can override a veto with 2/3 majority. The president negotiates treaties, but international treaties, but the Senate has to ratify it by 2/3 vote. The president appoints ministers or Supreme Court justices or cabinet heads, and Congress has to approve them. Congress has the ultimate power over all federal offices. The House can impeach or formally accuse the president, and then the Senate has the power to have a trial. Court over Congress, the authority to strike down any acts that Congress or the president makes that's violating the Constitution. And this shows you some examples. I would get to know this because you will have a question to give me an example of checks and balances, and it will need to be, you'll need to know a couple of these. So please familiarize yourself with the checks and balances. Then the sixth challenge is the principle that we are most ashamed of. Men and women in bondage were a source of wealth and power, especially in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia. And I'm talking about slaves here. The Philadelphia Convention, they faced this stark choice. Were they going to protect slavery or form a union without these states? So the slave-owning states did not want to give up their slavery. So within the Constitution, shockingly, they never use the word slave, but there are three conditions within the Constitution that talk about keeping slavery. The first one is the Three-Fifths Compromise that you're all probably familiar with. And if we go here, this part in blue. So this just shows how they are going to pick their representation, how they are going to count the states, which will be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons, and they mean slaves there. The second condition is to continue the slave trade. Now, they came up with a compromise that said, we'll continue it for 20 years. In other words, we're going to ask Congress, they are not allowed to, let's see, is this the one? Yes, right here. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808. So that's 20 years after they signed the Constitution. So they're basically saying you can't prohibit slavery for 20 years. And who knows why they picked a random number of 20 years. Maybe the slave owners, the life expectancy at that time wasn't very long, and if they were in their 30s or 40s writing it, maybe they didn't think they were going to be living that long, and that was their compromise. And then I don't think I went on to the third one. The third one is that the fugitive slave, returning the fugitive slaves. So if we go to right here, no persons held to service or labor under the laws escaping into another state shall, in consequence therein, be discharged from service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the property to whom such service or labor may be due. So basically, if someone flees to another state who is a slave, they have to be returned to their slave owner. That was obviously changed when they abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment, but these were originally in the Constitution, so you need to understand that part. If we look at the numbers per state, so this was the total population, and this was the population of slaves. So large slave-owning states like Virginia, where a good 40% of their population were slaves, they were the ones that wanted their slaves to be counted in order to get more representatives without giving them the rights that everybody else would have. So you can see each state, how many slaves that they had and which states were pushing for those clauses. Okay, so looking at the Constitution, I'd like to just quickly run through them. So you might as well read it. Turn to the back of your book and start reading it. I won't spend a whole lot of time in each area. I'm just going to point out important sections. But if I were you, I would read the Constitution so you know what it's about. The first part, our preamble, basically says we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And it sets what the purpose is. We want to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide common defense, general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our future children, our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution. So the authority rests in we the people. The first article is the longest article in the Constitution, and it describes what Congress may or may not do. The Founding Fathers thought that the legislative branch was most important, so they started with this, not the presidency. So the first article is about the legislature. I want to point out that in Section 8, Article 1, Section 8, this is the most important passage. It lists everything that Congress cannot. It lists a large amount of things that Congress can do. Let's see. Here's the list. I believe it's like 19 different explicit items that Congress has the power to do. Just to point out one, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing limited times to authors and inventors. I thought it was interesting that among establishing navies and establishing courts and post offices, that they wanted to establish education for science and arts. Unfortunately, arts are losing a lot of that protection, but that was one of the explicit things that Congress had. However, at the bottom, they had a lot of inherent, this clause here, to make all laws that shall be necessary and proper to carry into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by the Constitution of the United States. This is called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and you'll need to know that on your exam, the Necessary and Proper Clause. This is a nickname for it is the Elastic Clause, and this is basically says that Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper. And we'll learn more about that when we talk about some of the court cases. Also in Section 9, it talks about what Congress can't do, and this is where habeas corpus is brought up, that the government cannot hold prisoners without formally charging them of a crime. It also includes the Emoluments Clause, which talks about the fact that if no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, no person holding office holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present emolument, that means any kind of money, office, or title of any kind from any king, prince, or foreign state. So this is the clause that's been pointed to that says that the president cannot have their own business and make money, especially from foreign people, like having hotels in other countries and be making money while they're holding office. They are supposed to move all of their profits all of their businesses into a trust fund that is not connected to their family. So that's the Emoluments Clause. All right. And that goes for anyone in Congress, not just the president, but anyone. So the president is, the executive branch is written under Article 2. The president it tells what the conditions are, must be a natural born American with at least 35 years of age and is elected for a 4-year term. Each state decides who elects the electors, and winner takes all versus proportional representation. So today the people make the choice in every state. So the Electoral College in most states is based on winner takes all, especially in Nevada. So whoever wins the majority for the presidential election in that state, then all of their representatives. So in Nevada, we have 6 delegates, 2 that represent the number of senators we have, and 4 that represents the number of House of Representatives we have. So whoever wins the majority gets all 6 votes. That's how the Electoral College works. The executive power is vested in the president. Section 4 allows for removing the president on impeachment and for conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. 3 presidents, now 4 presidents, have faced formal impeachment proceedings, and now we have a president that has faced it twice. And at the recording of this time, I only know that that the president has been impeached and will go to trial with the Senate. So impeachment is done in the House, and it's just accusing someone of abusing the power of the office of the presidency. And the trial will be in the Senate. All right. Then, okay, so I'd like to just go over this video of the Electoral College because I think it's important to understand it a little bit deeper.
If you watch the news during a presidential election, you'll hear a lot of this.
What do the national polls look like?
Hillary Clinton's nationally. Joe Biden is currently ahead.
But these national polls don't actually tell you who's going to win.
Throw the national polls out the window. They don't matter at all. What matters are those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states. Most democracies around the world elect their head of state with a popular vote, so whoever gets the most votes wins. But in America, we do it a little differently. The US is the only country that picks its president using something called the Electoral College. It's made up of delegates from each US state. When Americans vote for president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will vote for. This is why, every so often, someone wins the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's happened twice in just the past 20 years. The majority of Americans do not like the system, and haven't for a long time. Both political parties have made attempts to get rid of it. So why does the US still use the Electoral College? And who actually benefits from it? The Electoral College is based on how people are represented in Congress, where each state has a number of representatives based on its population, and every state also gets 2 senators. So, for example, let's look at Texas, which has a huge population, and Vermont, which has a really small one. Texas has 36 representatives in Congress. Vermont only gets 1. Representatives in both states each represent roughly the same number of people. In the Electoral College, a state gets the same number of delegates as their congressional representatives, plus 2 for each senator. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, Vermont has 3. But this combination makes the number of people each delegate represents way different between states. In Texas, 1 electoral delegate represents 3 times the amount of people as 1 in Vermont. And that makes each individual person's vote in Vermont a lot more influential. The Electoral College creates discrepancies like this all over the country. A voter in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And the winner of the presidential election is the candidate who gets 270 or more of these Electoral College votes. These are the results of the 2016 election by state. You're probably more familiar with this version of it, a map of red states and blue states. But this chart tells a different story. You can see that no state is actually all red or all blue. But almost every state awards its electoral votes the same way. The candidate who gets the most votes in a state gets all its electoral votes. If they win the state by 1%, they win 100% of the electoral votes. In 2016, more than 4 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. In fact, more people voted for him there than in any other state except for 2. But it didn't matter. Hillary Clinton got more votes there, so she got all 55 of its electoral votes. Clinton never even campaigned in California. Polling showed she'd easily win the state. Trump only visited Texas once. He knew he'd basically have that state's electoral votes locked. But they both visited Florida 35 or more times. That's because Florida is usually a swing state. Polls show that the vote there could swing to one party or another nearly every election. Trump only won it in 2016 by 100,000 votes, out of more than 9 million. Swing states have changed over time thanks to shifting demographics and political views, and it's states like these where presidential candidates spend most of their time campaigning. It also means these states have way more influence over the election than these ones. A study found that voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the 2016 election as someone from a state like Utah. Voters in states like California or Missouri mattered very little. Swing states are where the election actually takes place. They get the attention and the influence, and they only exist because of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem very fair, but the Electoral College has always shifted power away from some people and towards others. It was how it was designed. Back when there were just a few states, not 50, they had to get all the states to agree on the Constitution. One problem. The northern states, which were largely anti-slavery, wanted only free people to count in the population towards electoral votes, which they had more of. The pro-slavery southern states were worried that they would be constantly outvoted and wanted enslaved people to count in determining the population. As a compromise, they settled on something called the Three-Fifths Clause. It established that an enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a person. In 1800, Pennsylvania, a northern state, and Virginia, a southern one, had about the same number of free people living there. But Virginia was also home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no freedom, let alone a vote, and ended up with more votes in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania. That year, those extra electoral votes gave the candidate from Virginia just enough to win. Even after the U.S. finally abolished slavery and eventually gave Black Americans the right to vote, white Southern leaders found ways to keep them from voting, like with discriminating laws like poll taxes and acts of violence. This meant they continued to have overrepresentation in the Electoral College on behalf of a large population that couldn't vote. The first time Congress attempted to replace the Electoral College with a simple popular vote was back in 1816, but senators from southern states blocked it, saying it would be deeply injurious to them. In 1969, Congress came even closer. Replacing the Electoral College had support in both parties and even passed the House, but it was blocked again by Southern senators. A senator from Alabama wrote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it. Why change a system that historically had and still was benefiting white Southerners?" Today, the states that the Electoral College benefits have changed, but it's still making some voters more powerful than others. If we look at the states with a lot of electoral votes for not a lot of people, and the states with a little electoral votes for a lot of people, these states are a lot wider and less diverse than the rest of America. And many of these states are Republican strongholds. These tend to vote Democratic. That's one reason the two most recent Republican presidents have won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. And since it's currently Democrats that are primarily disadvantaged by the Electoral College, they're the ones leading the charge to replace it with a popular vote.
Get rid of the Electoral College and everybody.
But as politics have changed, the people most critical of the Electoral College have too. In the 1948 presidential election, New York ended up being the major swing state. A congressman from Texas said, "I have no objection to the Negro in Harlem voting, but I do resent the fact that his vote is worth 100 times as much as the vote of a white man in Texas." Swing states change. What doesn't is that the Electoral College gives certain people more power to pick the president. And its biggest defenders have always been those who benefit the most from it.
All right. So I hope that was helpful. I like the idea that they break it down to the ratio of population, and that is because of the two senators. So if you have a smaller population, but you add on two senators compared to a huge population and you add on two senators, it gives the smaller states more power. So, all right. So moving on, let's see. Whoops, where are we here? The third third article is about the judicial branch. It sets up the Supreme Court and gives Congress the authorization to organize the courts. Alexander Hamilton once claimed this is our least dangerous branch of government. However, you may have a different set of opinion once we start talking about all these Supreme Court cases through history, how powerful the Supreme Court actually is. The justices are selected by the president, approved by the Senate, and have a tenure for life. Unless they die, get sick, or resign, they have that job for life. So we'll talk about whether that's a good move now or not. Chief Justice John Marshall, in the deciding case of Marbury versus Madison, ruled that the court could strike down acts of Congress. This we'll talk about a little later. This is an important court case that you'll have to read up on. So that's just giving you a little bit of a hint into that. The fourth article is about the relationships between the states. Mainly, the two things you need to remember is a state may not discriminate against citizens from other states. So whatever laws are in the state of Nevada, if you come from California, they should apply to you too. So whatever laws or privileges you have. So you can't say, oh, you're from, say we have the right to buy marijuana. You can't say it's only for people who live in Nevada. It has to include anyone who comes to Nevada, if that makes sense. Also, each state has a full faith and credit clause. So, for example, if you that means that records and court decisions transfer to other states. So, if you got married in a state that had same-sex marriages were legal, you could go to another state, and that state had to adhere to the fact that you were married because you were officially married within the laws of another state. So please read up on Article 4. It's only a couple paragraphs. Article 5 explains how to amend the Constitution. This is in bold. You need to know this. There are two ways to amend the Constitution. They're very similar, and it gets kind of confusing. So I'm just going to have you remember one way, and that's that 2/3 of the House and the Senate must approve the amendment first, and then 3/5 of the states must ratify it, either through a state legislature or the state conventions. So just remember those two processes. This will come up again when we start talking about amendments. All right. Article number 6 basically says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That's called the Supremacy Clause. You'll have to know that. It specifies that there is no religious test for holding any office, although some states do have religious tests for people. Not tests as in, an exam, but you have to be a certain religion in some states for some offices. All right, moving on. Article 7, you don't really need to worry about this. This is just basically explaining how they're ratifying the Constitution. So it was written in order to ratify that Constitution. So in order to approve that Constitution. So it was only kind of used once. You don't need to worry about that too much. All right, moving on. Then the Anti-Federalists, they didn't really want the federal government to have so much power, and they wanted to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This happened after they passed the Constitution, shortly after, within a couple years. The first 10 amendments were known as the Bill of Rights, and it set out the rights and liberty of every citizen, that every citizen is guaranteed. And it originally applied only to the federal government. But then once we passed the 14th Amendment, that extended the Bill of Rights to the states. However, the states, we'll talk about this later, but the states didn't give their people the rights so quickly. They had to be forced to by the Supreme Court. They had to, each time a conflict came up, the Supreme Court had to say, hey, state, whatever the state was, you and all other states have to abide by the Bill of Rights. This applies to states as well as federal government. There's 17 amendments in the Constitution. You should know there's 7 articles and 17 amendments. I'm sorry. 17 amendments after the Bill of Rights. So there's 27 amendments. I thought, that doesn't make sense. 27 amendments, sorry. So 10 in the Bill of Rights, and then after that, 17 were added. Most of them have to do with extending more rights or adjusting election rules or changes in government operations, etc. We will go through them later, but for now, I suggest you look at the 27 amendments so you know. 25th Amendment has come up a lot in the news, so you can read up on that. You should know all the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. But as far as amending the Constitution now, if you look at these are the how many times since 1999 different topics have come up. So an amendment to the Constitution for Congress to only pass a balanced budget. That means they cannot pass a budget with a deficit, which means passing a budget that is way more than the money they're planning on taking in, which Congress does every 2 years. So that is one thing that the population is interested in. Also, campaign finance, restricting big corporations from donating to campaigns. Term limits for Congress, we'll talk about that. Flag desecration, there's been a lot of proposals for that. Direct election of the president, so popular vote, do away with the Electoral College. Equal rights for men and women, school prayer, and no same-sex marriage. That has also been proposed. So, so far we haven't had an amendment to the Constitution for a while. So to wrap this part up before we get to the Nevada Constitution, Americans disagree about how to read the Constitution. There's 2 different views. One's the originalism, which is strict construction that Americans are bound to the literal meaning of the Constitution and its amendments as the people who wrote it and ratified understood them. And then there's the pragmatist view, which is that we cannot help but bring our own background, ideas, and judgment and think about the meaning of the document as it applies to us today. So please read up on those 2. You will need to know the definition you'll be asked a question on the exam between originalism and pragmatism. All right, so there's another, I'm running out of time, so I won't be showing you this, but please watch this PBS crash course. It'll kind of solidify everything that we've been talking about. And now we'll go on quickly to the Nevada Constitution. This was formed in 1864 around the time of the Civil War. Nevada has 3 nicknames. You can read in the material of why they have these nicknames. The Silver State, based on the silver mining that was found here. Battle-born State, because the state was born out of the end of the Civil War. And the Sagebrush State, because we have lots of land disputes in the 70s and 80s around Yucca Mountain, the atomic test site, Nellis Air Force Base, etc. There were 3 conditions to Nevada becoming a state. One was that they renounced slavery, so it's put right there in the preamble. So our Constitution, as opposed to the U.S. Constitution, immediately said no slavery. They had to commit to religious tolerance. In the Constitution, there was a large Mormon presence, and the federal government was worried that Nevada would become a religious state. So they had to allow for religious freedom. And then they had to cede all unclaimed territory to the federal government. So 80% of Nevada's land is run by BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, not to be confused with Black Lives Matter, and other government holdings. So Nevada's Constitution, a lot of these things I'm going to be comparing to the U.S. Constitution, which will be on your discussion questions, so pay attention to this. The U.S. Constitution is one of the briefest around. The Nevada Constitution has 56,000 words compared to 7,500. It was the longest and the most costly. They were under a time pressure because Abraham Lincoln was up for re-election, so they had to telegraph the Constitution to the district, to Washington, and so it was the most costly telegraph around. The U.S. Constitution, like I said, has 27 amendments. The Nevada amendments are over 130. The Nevada Constitution is much easier to amend. It only needs a simple majority, and it favors voting majorities as opposed to supermajorities like 2/3 or 3/4. And it has lesser protection for voter minorities, which means that a simple majority can pass something. But they do have a Declaration of Rights similar to our Bill of Rights. It's a little bit more extensive. And in the Nevada Constitution, it includes clauses for education and gaming, which we don't have in the Nevada Constitution. And it's a strong supporter of property rights. The structure is similar to the U.S. There you see the division of powers, the checks and balances, and it establishes a basic structure for Nevada's government. The Declaration of Rights, like I said, are right at the top of the Constitution. There's greater protection for especially property rights. We have various ways of direct democracy, like I told you before, referendum and initiative. And Madison talks about this dilemma. And I like these two quotes because it helps us understand, how a majority can pass something or elect someone. But what about the minority? So it says it is nearly impossible to protect the right of the majority to govern, while at the same time protect the minority from tyranny of the majority. So we see this now playing out in our U.S. government. We have a majority that picked a president and a minority that feels like their voice isn't heard. And that can be opposite. The last 4 years, it's been completely opposite. But what we do have, the solution is a constitution that contains protections for individual rights. So a majority can govern, but only within specified constraints. In other words, a majority cannot take away the rights of the minority. And when I don't mean minority in the racial sense, I mean in numbers. All right. So if you need to rewind what I just said, just to make that clear, or read this portion that it talks about in your readings from the Battleborn readout. The Nevada Constitution, I pulled it up here. It's long. Whenever we have an amendment, they plug it right into where it is. I'm not going to make you read or learn what's in the Nevada Constitution because it is so long, as you can see. So I just wanted to prove my point there. All right. So in the U.S. Constitution, in the Fifth Amendment, there is a taking clause, and it says that the U.S. can take property if it is deemed necessary by the federal government. So there was a case, this wasn't in Nevada, but it was reflected in Nevada's recent government. It was called Kelo versus the City of New London. It was a case where the local government took a piece of land, sold it to took a piece of land under the taking clause, saying that they needed it for everyone else, and sold it to a developer that built like a shopping center or something like that. And people said, hey, that's not right. You can't take away our land. You're turning the Fifth Amendment into individual property rights and you're granting the government authority. You can't do that. But the Supreme Court ruled that, yes, they could, because they said that, the benefits, that the economic growth of that shopping center increased government revenues, so everybody was able to get some benefit from that. Well, this kind of made especially the state of Nevada and a lot of other states very angry. But the consolation of that ruling was that the Supreme Court said state and local governments are free to enact any limitations on the takings of this government. So what Nevada did is they provided a property owner's bill of rights. They made some provisions. So they basically said, all right, we feel so strongly about property rights that we're going to put some limitations on this. And that is that the government has the burden of proof that there is a public use for it. A court jury needs to decide if this is considered public use. The land that they're buying from an individual has to be valued at the highest and best use and given just compensation, including compounded interest, reasonable costs, and expenses. And it has to be the price at the highest price on an open market. And if that land is not used as stated in 5 years, then the land reverts back to the original owner. And the owner is not liable for attorney fees. So this put a lot of restrictions on the government taking land for that purpose. So it made it very difficult for people to take land for that purpose. Yes. All right, moving on. Freedom of speech, freedom of action, freedom of conscience. This is all in the Nevada Bill of Rights, they call them the Bill of Rights. So to hold or consider a fact, a viewpoint, or a thought is independent of other viewpoints. This is called thoughts or beliefs. They believe that there is no thought crimes. So in the state of Nevada, you're allowed to think and believe whatever you want. However, there's a definition of hate crimes, and that is something that is already a crime motivated by race, sex, age, and variety of similar factors. So hate crimes are not allowed under freedom of conscience. And things that are unique to Nevada is that gambling and education, this is mentioned in the state constitution, education must be funded before any other budget item. And I know what you're saying. Why is Nevada's education so low compared to all the other states if it's written in the Constitution? It basically said that it has to be funded. It doesn't tell how much. And we'll learn about that later, how low our funding is for education. Also, prostitution is not in the Constitution, but left up to the counties with one restriction, that it cannot be legal in any counties with populations greater than 400,000. So that leaves out Reno, Washoe County, and Clark County. Direct democracy, please review this, the initiative, referendum, and recall. We've already talked about an initiative and referendum, but a recall is a special election in which voters can remove an office holder before his or her term is over. Please read up on this so you know the conditions for that. And I'll just repeat, an initiative is a citizen-sponsored proposal that can result in a new or amended legislation or a state constitutional amendment. And then a referendum is when citizens or the legislature place an already existing law on the ballot for possible repeal by the voters. And last fun tax facts. Bet you never thought you would see fun and tax together, but Nevada does not allow income tax, taxes on lotteries, inheritance tax, taxes to be used for religious purposes or food. But they do have 80% of their slot machine taxes are earmarked for education. Property tax has a cap, and Nevada tax liquor, cigarettes, tobacco, marijuana, insurance policies, jet fuels, motel rooms for rent, and diesel fuel, and a lot more. In conclusion, Nevada is a highly individualistic and libertarian state. The majority rule is dominant. We have some direct democracy and simple majorities. There are many civil liberties and civil rights in the Constitution, although a simple majority can change that, but thank goodness we have these rights in place on the federal level as well. Taxes need supermajority, so 2/3 of a vote is needed to change any change any of the tax laws. Nevada has historic economic opportunities. All right, so going on to our exam notes. For the federal constitution, you need to know the following topics about the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Nevada Constitution. You need to know those 6 arguments shaping the Constitution. Who do citizens vote for before the amendments? With the original Constitution, we just voted for the House of Representatives. That's not the case now. You need to know the argument about big states, small states, how we picked our representatives. That will be an essay question. You need to know about checks and balances and the separation of powers. You need to understand the Electoral College, the 3 clauses that contain the idea of slavery in the Constitution. And you need to know what the first 3 articles are about. It's about the first 3 branches. So you need to know which is which. The first article is the legislative branch. Second article is about the executive branch. And the third article is about the judicial branch. And then you need to understand originalism and versus pragmatism. And then your exam notes, the conditions for Nevada becoming a statehood, religious tolerance, no slavery, and ceding the remaining unclaimed land to the federal government. You need to know the differences between the U.S. and the Nevada Constitution. There are many. Please read your assignment and review the slides. And then you need to know about these 3 forms of direct democracy. All right, that's it for today. Sorry, it's a little bit longer than an hour, but very important topic. Thank you, and see you next time.